Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? A silent observer in a world that moves on without you? Especially when that world is your own family? This is the story of Leo. To his family, he was a footnote in a story of success they were writing for themselves. But when disaster struck, the footnote became the headline, and the ghost they never saw became the only person who could save them. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air in their suburban Chicago home, a smell that was supposed to mean comfort and family. For Leo, it was the scent of his own invisibility. It was Sunday dinner, a weekly ritual where his family gathered to celebrate their victories. His father, Robert, sat at the head of the table, a king in his castle, beaming as his eldest son, Mark, recounted a recent win at his law firm. His other son, David, a rising star in finance, chimed in with his own market predictions. Leo sat silently, pushing a stray pea around his plate. He hadn't been asked a single question. It wasn't malicious, it was worse. It was as if he simply wasn't there. And the partners were so impressed they're talking about a junior promotion by year's end, Mark boasted, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "That's my boy," Robert boomed, raising his glass. "To success. To making something of yourself." His eyes swept across the table, passing over Leo as if he were part of the furniture. The toast was a celebration for his other sons, and a subtle, stinging indictment of his youngest. Leo felt the familiar heat rise in his cheeks. He risked a glance at his mother, Helen. She offered him a small, pained smile from across the table, a silent apology she had perfected over the years. It was a look that said, "I see you," but it was never followed by words. Her fear of her husband's temper was a wall between them. David, catching Leo's eye, smirked. "Hey, Leo, you got any big plans? Still figuring out which video game to conquer next?" Mark chuckled. "Leave him be, Dave. The world needs ditch diggers, too." The laughter that followed was the cruelest sound in the world. It wasn't just a joke, it was a confirmation of his status. Leo's fork clattered onto his plate. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The laughter died, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. "Excuse me," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, and fled the room. He didn't go to his bedroom. Instead, he slipped out the back door into the chilly autumn air. He sat on the steps of the deck, wrapping his arms around himself, listening to the muffled sounds of his family's life continuing without him. The distant echo of their laughter was a constant reminder of the space he was supposed to fill, but never could. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just tired. Tired of hoping for a change that never came. He didn't know it then, but a change was coming. Not the one he had hoped for, but a violent, terrifying shift that would shatter their perfect world and force them to see the sun they had always looked straight through. The next morning, the house was quiet. The energy of the previous night's dinner had dissipated, leaving behind a sterile silence. Leo found himself in the kitchen, staring into an open refrigerator, though he wasn't hungry. He was simply going through the motions of a life he felt disconnected from. He heard soft footsteps behind him and knew, without turning, that it was his mother. Helen approached him cautiously, as if he were a wounded animal she was afraid of startling. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You know I love you, don't you?" she whispered. Her voice was heavy with the guilt of her own silence. Leo forced a weak smile without looking at her. "I know, Mom," he replied, but the words felt hollow. Her affection was a flickering candle in a storm, real, but never strong enough to offer true warmth or protection. It was a love confined by fear, always secondary to her husband's rigid expectations. She sighed, her hand lingering on his shoulder. "You're a good person, Leo. You have a kind heart. I wish—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "I wish your father could see it. I wish I were strong enough to make him." The constant internal battle she faced was etched on her face, and it consumed her from the inside out. Just then, Robert entered the kitchen, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence like thunder before a storm. He was already dressed in a crisp suit, ready to conquer his day. He saw his wife's gentle gesture and his face hardened. "Enough of this coddling, Helen," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet moment. "The boy needs a backbone, not a hand to hold." The words were like daggers, and Leo instinctively lowered his head, the familiar shame washing over him. Helen flinched and pulled her hand back as if burned. She wanted to argue, to defend her son, but her voice was trapped, as it always was. She simply averted her gaze, her posture shrinking in her husband's presence. Leo watched the exchange in silence, a fresh wave of loneliness crashing over him. There was no shield from the constant barrage of disapproval. After Robert grabbed his coffee and left for his home office, Helen turned back to her son, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she said, her voice cracking. "Sometimes, I just can't stand up to him." For a fleeting moment, Leo felt a surge of strength that wasn't for himself, but for her. He took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It's okay, Mom. I'm used to it," he murmured, a lie meant to soothe her pain, even though it amplified his own. He hid his wounds to keep from adding to hers. She pulled him into a tight hug, her heart aching. She wanted to protect him from the world, and especially from his own father, but she felt powerless. Leo closed his eyes, letting the embrace be a momentary refuge from the harshness of his reality. They had no idea that their world was about to be upended, and that the strength they both sought would be forged in the crucible of a shared nightmare. A few days later, Robert announced a family road trip. "We're driving up to Wisconsin for the weekend," he declared at breakfast. "Your aunt and uncle are expecting us." For Mark and David, the news was met with enthusiasm. It was another stage on which to perform, another audience for their tales of success. They immediately started talking about the new boat their uncle had bought and the golf course near the lake house. For Leo, the announcement landed with a thud. His presence on the trip felt like an afterthought, a non-negotiable clause in a contract he hadn't agreed to. Still, a tiny, stubborn part of him hoped that a change of scenery might offer a moment of peace. His mother had insisted he come. "It'll be good for you, honey," she had said, her eyes pleading with him to try. Leo had simply nodded, his expression unreadable. On the day of departure, the air was thick with an excitement that didn't include him. As he climbed into the back of the family's large SUV, he felt like an intruder, occupying space that no one wanted him to fill. The sound of his brother's laughter and cheerful banter enveloped him. Yet he remained on the outside, an island of silence in a sea of noise. The highway stretched out before them, a gray ribbon winding through the flat, expansive landscapes of the Midwest. Leo stared out the window, watching the endless fields of corn and distant farmhouses blur into a green and brown tapestry. It was a mental escape from the suffocating atmosphere inside the car. With every mile that passed, his sense of isolation grew. From the passenger seat, Helen would occasionally glance at him in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were filled with a familiar mix of love and worry, a silent conversation he had learned to understand. He would offer a small, tight-lipped smile in return. Robert, meanwhile, was in his element, gripping the steering wheel and holding court with his two older sons about market trends and career trajectories. Leo was invisible to him, a non-entity with nothing to add. Halfway through the journey, an argument broke out between Mark and David over some trivial sports rivalry. The bickering soon turned into jabs aimed at Leo. "At least we're passionate about something, right, Leo?" Mark sneered. "What's your passion these days? Leveling up?" The contempt, sharpened by their collective laughter, hurt more than any direct insult. The mood in the car was a volatile mix of forced cheer and simmering tension. Lost in his own thoughts, Leo couldn't possibly know that this trip was the precipice of a dramatic turn in his life. He felt that no one believed in him. But what about you? Do you believe the underdog can become the hero? If you think stories of courage deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and like this video so you can follow every step of this incredible journey. The SUV was cruising down a narrow, two-lane country road in rural Wisconsin, flanked by dense walls of pine trees. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the pavement. Inside the car, the argument had subsided into a tense quiet. Suddenly, a massive semi-truck, its headlights blazing like angry eyes, swerved into their lane as it rounded a sharp bend. Robert yelled, wrenching the steering wheel in a desperate attempt to avoid a head-on collision. The sickening screech of tires filled the air, a sound that would be seared into their memories forever. The world became a violent blur of motion and noise. The impact was brutal, a deafening crunch of metal and shattering glass. The SUV was thrown from the road, flipping over and over down a steep wooded embankment before finally coming to a rest on its side. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the crash itself, broken only by the faint hiss of a leaking fluid and the soft groans of the injured. Leo opened his eyes, his body screaming in protest. The sharp, metallic scent of gasoline and airbag residue filled his lungs. For a moment, he was completely disoriented, his mind struggling to catch up with the horror of what had just happened. His heart hammered against his ribs, and he thought, for a fleeting second, that he was paralyzed. Slowly, his senses returned. He could hear his brothers, Mark and David, moaning in pain but conscious. His mother was crying hysterically, her voice a raw, desperate plea as she tried to shake Robert awake. His father was slumped over the steering wheel, motionless, with a dark stream of blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The sight sent a jolt of pure, cold panic through Leo. He took a deep, ragged breath. The fear was a living thing inside him, threatening to swallow him whole. But as he looked at his family, broken, terrified, and helpless, something else stirred within him. It was a primal, protective instinct he never knew he possessed. He had to act. His brothers were shouting, disoriented and lost in their own pain. One was trying to kick a shattered window out, while the other just sobbed. The chaos was escalating, feeding a collective sense of powerlessness. But inside Leo, a switch had been flipped. For the first time in his life, he didn't wait for an order. He didn't shrink into the background. His own survival instinct, and something more, took over. He knew that if he didn't do something, the worst was yet to come. They were all depending on him, even if they didn't know it yet. "Be calm! I'll figure this out!" he yelled, his voice cracking but filled with a surprising firmness. The shouting stopped. His family turned to look at him, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. No one had ever heard that tone from Leo before. It was the voice of someone taking charge. With trembling hands, he began to assess the situation, his fear now mixed with a strange, unfamiliar courage. In that moment, Leo took the first step toward becoming the one thing they never imagined he could be, their only hope. The dust from the deployed airbags was still settling as his brother's panic began to spiral. Mark was bleeding from a cut on his arm, yelling about his leg being trapped. David was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror. The scene was descending into pure chaos, a symphony of fear and pain. Helen was clinging to Robert's limp hand, her pleas for him to wake up growing more frantic. Her maternal instinct was torn between the terror of losing her husband and the need to comfort her children, leaving her paralyzed by grief. Leo, despite the throbbing pain in his side, forced his mind to focus. He knew he had to remain calm, or they would all be consumed by the hysteria. He wasn't a leader, he wasn't a hero, he was just Leo. But right now, that had to be enough. "Everyone needs to get out of the car!" he shouted again, his voice stronger this time, cutting through the noise. His brothers stared at him, their expressions bewildered, as if he had no right to give instructions. "You don't know what you're doing!" Mark shot back, his voice laced with the old, familiar condescension, even now. But there was no time for their old dynamic. "Maybe not," Leo retorted. "But if we stay in here, we're all in danger. The car could catch fire." He didn't wait for their approval. He scrambled over the twisted seats, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs, and helped David unbuckle his seatbelt. He pushed open a door that was hanging precariously on its hinges, creating a narrow escape route. "Go! Get out now!" he urged. Slowly, Hesitantly, his family began to move. One by one, they crawled out of the mangled wreck, their movements clumsy and pained. The screech of twisted metal as they moved was a grim reminder of how close they had come to death and how fragile their situation remained. Leo's focus was on his father. With his mother's help, he worked to free Robert from the driver's seat. His father's dead weight was immense, and every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through Leo's own body. But he refused to stop. When they finally managed to drag him clear of the vehicle, Helen collapsed beside her husband on the damp earth. "He's barely breathing," she cried, her voice breaking with despair. The panic threatened to return, but Leo knew he couldn't let it. He looked around. They were on a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by dark woods. There were no headlights in the distance, no signs of civilization. As dusk settled, the encroaching darkness felt like a physical presence, amplifying their fear. They were alone, vulnerable, and without any immediate prospect of help. In that chilling moment, Leo understood the full gravity of their situation. The choice was no longer his to make. He had to take the lead, or they might all perish on the side of that lonely road. Leo's heart was pounding, a frantic drum against his bruised ribs, but his mind was surprisingly clear. He looked at his brothers, huddled together in fear, and then at his mother, weeping over his father's still form. "You have to help me," he said, his voice steady and firm, silencing the rising tide of panic. "If we just wait here, Dad might not make it." Mark, his face pale and streaked with dirt, opened his mouth to argue, but Leo met his gaze with an intensity he'd never shown before. "Maybe I don't know exactly what to do," Leo said, his voice low but unwavering, "but I know that doing nothing is the surest way to lose him. If you have a better idea, tell me now. Otherwise, help me." Silence was his answer. The arrogance had been stripped away from his brothers, replaced by a raw, primal fear. For the first time, they seemed to see him not as their failure of a brother, but as someone with a plan. Kneeling beside his father, Leo gently tilted Robert's head back to clear his airway, a half-remembered tip from a first-aid video he'd once watched. He wasn't a doctor, but he had to try something. "We need to keep him warm and get him off this damp ground," he instructed. "Check the trunk. Find blankets, jackets, anything." Hesitantly at first, then with a dawning sense of purpose, his brothers obeyed. They rummaged through the wreckage, their movements clumsy but deliberate. As they worked, Leo felt a subtle shift in the air. The looks they gave him were no longer filled with contempt, but with a flicker of something else, reluctant trust. While they gathered supplies, Leo ignored the searing pain in his own side. There was no room for his own suffering. His only priority was keeping his family together and his father alive. Helen watched him, her tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of astonishment and pride. It was as if she was seeing a hidden version of her son emerge from the shadows. They carefully moved Robert onto a makeshift bed of coats and blankets, away from the immediate danger of the wreck, but his breathing remained shallow and erratic. The situation was still critical. As the last light of day vanished, the woods around them came alive with the unsettling sounds of the night, amplifying their sense of isolation. One of his brothers, David, spoke in a hushed, trembling voice. "What if he doesn't make it, Leo?" Leo took a deep breath, the cold night air burning his lungs. "He will," he replied, the words feeling more like a vow than a statement of fact. "I won't let him go." The night was just beginning, and the darkness pressed in on them, cold and unforgiving. But in the midst of it all, Leo stood as a small beacon of resolve. The rejected son was becoming the pillar they all desperately needed to lean on. As the night deepened, a biting cold swept through the woods, sharp as a razor's edge. The family shivered, their thin jackets offering little protection. Leo, despite his own exhaustion and the relentless ache in his body, kept his focus sharp, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. Robert's condition remained unchanged. He was still unconscious, his breathing a faint, fragile rhythm that seemed like it could stop at any moment. Helen never left his side, her hand clutching his, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. Leo felt the immense weight of his family's survival settling squarely on his shoulders, but he refused to let the fear crush him. "We need a fire," he announced, his voice cutting through the grim silence. "And we need to take turns watching over Dad." Mark, who had always been the first to challenge him, simply nodded. The old hierarchy had crumbled. In this desperate new reality, Leo was in command. "What do you need us to do?" he asked, his voice subdued. Leo organized them with an efficiency that surprised even himself. He sent David to gather dry twigs and branches, while Mark was tasked with checking their meager supplies. The initial chaos had given way to a fragile, collective effort, all orchestrated by the son they had always dismissed. Helen watched him, her heart a tangled mess of fear and awe. She had never seen this side of Leo, this determined, resilient young man who refused to surrender to despair. It was as if the boy she knew had been forged into a man in the crucible of the crash. Exhausted, Leo sat for a moment, leaning against a tree and looking up at the star-filled sky. He thought about how, for his entire life, he had yearned for their respect. Now, in the midst of this nightmare, he was finally earning it, not with wealth or a career, but with a strength he never knew he had. The irony was not lost on him. The fatigue was a heavy cloak threatening to pull him under, but he pushed himself to his feet again. There was no room for rest. His family's lives were in his hands, and failure was not an option. The scorn that had followed him for years was now replaced by the quiet, watchful respect of his brothers. They no longer laughed at him. They followed his lead, their survival depending on his next command. That night, under a cold, indifferent moon, Leo discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. And what about you? Have you ever been in a moment where you had to be stronger than you ever thought possible? If you have, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and like to see just how far Leo's newfound courage will take him. The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and pink, but it brought no relief. In the cold morning air, Robert's condition had taken a turn for the worse. His breathing, already shallow, was now frighteningly faint, and a bluish tint was beginning to color his lips. A fresh wave of panic rippled through the family. Helen began to sob uncontrollably, her quiet prayers giving way to desperate cries for a miracle. Mark and David, who had shown a flicker of resilience during the night, were now frozen in terror, their brief composure shattered. All eyes, once again, turned to Leo. He was their anchor, their last hope. He knelt beside his father, pressing his ear to his chest. The heartbeat was faint and irregular. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that they were out of time. "If we don't do something right now, we're going to lose him," he said, his voice laced with an urgency that shook them all from their stupor. Frantically, he searched through the debris from the car, his mind racing. He remembered a scene from a movie, a technique he'd seen online. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all he had. He propped his father's torso up with a rolled-up blanket to ease the pressure on his lungs, trying to facilitate his breathing. It was a crude, improvised measure, but it might buy them precious seconds. His brothers watched, their faces etched with disbelief. "How do you know any of this?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't," Leo answered without looking up, his focus entirely on his father. "I just know I have to try." His raw courage was slowly chipping away at their lifelong perception of him, replacing it with a grudging, genuine respect. Helen gripped his arm, her knuckles white. "You're all we have, Leo," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. That simple, desperate admission was the validation he had craved his entire life, delivered in the most harrowing moment imaginable. While the others were paralyzed by grief, Leo remained a pillar of focus. Every second was critical. His body trembled with adrenaline and fear, but his mind remained sharp, guiding his hands. The weight of the moment was immense. One of his brothers suggested that someone should leave the group and walk down the road to find help. Leo hesitated. Splitting up was a huge risk. They were in the middle of nowhere. But staying put was becoming an even greater one. The dilemma tore at him. It was a choice between the relative safety of staying together and the terrifying uncertainty of venturing out alone. He realized with a heavy heart that the decision was his and his alone. His father's life and the future of his entire family rested on the courage of his next move. He was no longer just the overlooked son, he was the one responsible for everyone's survival. As another evening began to cast its long shadows, Robert's breathing faltered again. The brief improvement Leo had managed to secure was fading. The family's hope, which had flickered throughout the day, was now threatening to be extinguished completely. Leo knew he couldn't wait for a miracle to find them. He had to go out and bring one back. "I'm going to walk for help," he announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You all stay here. Keep the fire going and don't leave Dad's side for a second." Helen grabbed his hand, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Leo, it's too dangerous. You can't go alone." "It's more dangerous if I don't," he replied gently, pulling his hand away. "We're out of options." He gave his brothers clear instructions on how to care for their father, his tone calm and authoritative. They listened intently, nodding in agreement. The boys, who had once mocked his every move, now looked to him as their commander. As he started walking down the dark, empty road, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. Each step took him further from the faint light of their campfire and deeper into the oppressive darkness of the Wisconsin wilderness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his own footsteps on the gravel shoulder and the frantic beating of his own heart. With every step, the ghosts of his past rose up to meet him. The taunts, the insults, the dismissive glances, they all echoed in his mind. "You'll never amount to anything, Leo. A failure, a disgrace." The voices were relentless, chipping away at his resolve. For a moment, he faltered, his pace slowing. Who was he to think he could do this? No one had ever believed in him. Why should he believe in himself now? Tears of frustration and exhaustion streamed down his face, cold against his skin. He looked up at the black, starless sky and whispered to the emptiness, "Can I do this? Am I strong enough?" The crushing loneliness of the road felt like a physical weight, and the thought of turning back, of giving up, was a sweet, tempting poison. But then, an image flashed in his mind, his father, gasping for air, his mother, her face a mask of desperate hope, whispering, "You're all we have." That single memory was a spark in the darkness. He wiped his tears away with the back of a dirty hand and took a deep, shuddering breath. He wasn't walking to prove them wrong anymore. He was walking to save them. Though his body screamed for rest, he pushed forward, his heavy steps now filled with a grim determination. Each yard he covered was a small victory against the doubt that had plagued him his entire life. "I'm not that kid anymore," he thought, his inner voice a defiant roar. "Tonight, I am the strength this family needs." And so he walked on, a solitary figure battling not just the endless road, but the demons that had haunted him for a lifetime. The hours on the road felt like an eternity. Leo's legs were numb, his body screaming in protest, but he pushed onward, fueled by a desperate hope. Finally, just as his strength gave out and he fell to his knees, he saw it. A single flickering light in the distance. It was a small farmhouse. With his last ounce of energy, he stumbled to the door and pounded on it, gasping for help before collapsing. The elderly couple who answered didn't hesitate. Within minutes, Leo was in the passenger seat of an old pickup truck, guiding the man back toward the crash site. The wail of an ambulance, which the man's wife had called, echoed in the distance, a beautiful, piercing sound of salvation. When they arrived, Helen saw Leo emerge from the truck and ran to him, her face a mess of tears and relief. "You did it! Oh, Leo, you did it!" she cried, clinging to him as if he were an anchor. His brothers stood back, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. The hero they were waiting for had been among them all along. In the sterile, quiet waiting room of the hospital, hours later, a doctor finally approached them. "He's going to make it," he announced. The immediate care he received at the scene, keeping his airway clear and his body warm, made all the difference. Whoever did that saved his life. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief filled the room, and then all eyes turned to Leo. In that single, silent moment, the years of scorn and ridicule dissolved, replaced by a profound, unspoken respect. He didn't need their apologies. He could see in their eyes that the boy they once called a failure was now the man who had held them all together. Days later, sitting by his father's bedside, Leo finally heard the words he had once thought impossible. "You saved us, son," Robert whispered, his voice weak but clear. "I was so wrong. I thought being a man was about success and power. You showed me it's about courage and love." Leaving the hospital, they were not the same family. The accident that should have destroyed them had instead rebuilt them on a new foundation of humility and gratitude. At their next Sunday dinner, the table was filled not with tension, but with quiet conversation. Robert raised his glass, his hand still trembling slightly. "To my son, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The strongest man I know." Leo smiled, a true, peaceful smile. He had finally found his place, not by becoming what they wanted, but by becoming who he was meant to be. Just as Leo found a strength he never knew he had, you too have the power to overcome the challenges in your life. If this story moved you, show your support with a like, subscribe for more inspiring content, and share in the comments what part of Leo's journey resonated with you the most. And don't go anywhere. There's another incredible story waiting for you right here on this channel to continue this journey of inspiration.